Okay, so you know how we all talk about like the importance of reading?
Yeah,
Like everybody says kids got to learn to read, it's super important.
right. Absolutely.
But like what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Like what does it mean to really teach reading comprehension, beyond just like sounding out words?
Well, that's
What we're going to get into today.
yeah, that's a huge question.
It is a huge question.
And it's something that a lot of researchers have been looking at
Exactly. And luckily for us, there's this
for decades.
yeah, there's this awesome new study that kind of brings all this research together.
Exactly. It's like a meta-analysis. It looks at a bunch of other research.
Yeah, it looked at like 66 other research papers.
Yeah, 66 studies spanning all the way from 1980
Oh, wow.
to 2023.
So like a solid, 40 plus years of research.
More than 40 years of research on reading comprehension instruction, and they looked at K through 12.
Yeah, so like the whole span
The whole thing.
of a kid's education.
And what they found was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and this was done, you said, across like 6 different universities.
Yeah, it was a big collaborative effort.
Wow. So it's really like a big, robust study to kind of dig into this. So our mission today is to like,
Our mission today is to figure out what is going on in reading comprehension instruction.
yeah, like how has it
How did it change?
changed since the late 1970s?
Yeah, and really, what are like the key takeaways for for folks like us who want to make sure that
For teachers, for parents, for anyone who's interested in education.
yeah, anyone who's interested in education for themselves, for their kids, like what does this all mean? So we're gonna
What should we be doing?
yeah, what should we be doing and what's working?
Exactly.
So to start off, like you were saying, we got to kind of go back in time a little bit.
We got to set a baseline.
Oh,
Got to understand where we started.
yeah, like what was going on in classrooms back in the 70s when it came to reading comprehension?
Right. So this meta-analysis that we're looking at uses the work of Dolores Durkin as kind of a starting point.
Right. So Dolores Durkin, she was a researcher back in the late 1970s,
Okay.
and she did this really in-depth study where she went into classrooms and actually observed what teachers were doing
Oh, wow.
in grades 3 through 6.
Okay.
And she was looking at English language arts and social studies instruction.
So like how those subjects were being taught.
Exactly. And what she found was honestly kind of shocking.
Really?
Yeah, she found that teachers were spending less than 1% of their time actually teaching kids how to understand what they were reading.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%.
That's wild.
Isn't that wild?
Like they were spending all this time with books, with text, with reading, but almost no time on actually like,
Here's the book, read it.
yeah, like how do you actually make sense of this?
Exactly, like figure it out on your own.
Yeah. And for you, I mean, as someone who, has dedicated so much of your career to education and to like really
Fully deep understand.
yeah, to like really helping people understand things, does that surprise you that that was the landscape back then? Like, what does that say about how we thought about reading?
It's honestly pretty mind-blowing to think about that was the norm just a few decades ago. I mean,
Yeah.
it really highlights how much our understanding of reading and how we teach it has evolved.
Yeah.
Back then there was maybe this assumption that comprehension would just kind of happen naturally.
Right. Like, oh, you can decode the words you're reading.
Yeah, you're reading the words.
You're good.
You must be understanding them.
Yeah. But clearly that's not how it works.
Not at all.
So thank goodness for all the research that's come since then.
Absolutely.
So since Durkin's work, like you were saying, there's been this huge push to figure out better ways to teach comprehension.
Right. There have been tons of studies. Lots of research, new instructional strategies,
Like tons of resources for teachers.
guides, professional development programs, like all sorts of things designed to help teachers improve their comprehension instruction.
Yeah. So like we know more now than we did back then about how to do this effectively.
Right. And that's what makes this new meta-analysis so interesting.
Okay. Why is that?
Because it shows that despite all of this research and all of these efforts to improve instruction,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these proven methods still aren't making their way into classrooms consistently.
Oh, wow.
So there's this gap between what research says
Yeah.
and what's actually happening in schools.
That's kind of a bummer.
It is kind of a bummer because we know how to do this better,
Right.
but it's not always translating into practice.
Yeah. And this actually reminds me of something else that we talk about a lot in education, which is the whole science of reading movement.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you know how there's been this big push to make sure that we're teaching phonics and those foundational skills.
Based on the research?
Yeah, based on the research.
Big evidence.
The evidence.
Yeah.
So it seems like we need a similar movement
Okay.
for comprehension instruction.
Like a science of comprehension movement. Yeah, exactly. Because just like with phonics, we have the research, we know what works, but we need to make sure that those practices are actually happening in classrooms.
So, okay, so If teachers aren't spending a ton of time on explicit comprehension strategy instruction, then what are they doing during reading time?
Well, that's a good question, and this study actually gives us some insight into that.
Okay.
So across all of the studies that they looked at,
Like all 66 of them?
yeah, K through 12, they found that on average, teachers were spending about 23% of class time on reading comprehension instruction.
Okay, 23%. That seems,
So it's not nothing,
it's not nothing.
but it's also not a huge amount.
Yeah, like when you think about it, it's like less than a quarter.
Exactly, and the researchers actually point out that this number probably varies a lot depending on the grade level.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like you would hope that as kids get older, they're
Yeah.
getting more explicit instruction and comprehension.
Yeah.
But we don't really know for sure because the studies didn't always report that level of detail.
Right. And like you were saying before, those averages can be deceiving
Absolutely.
because you don't know what's hiding within that average.
Right.
Okay, so 23% on comprehension. But there's another finding that's honestly kind of mind-blowing to me.
Oh, yeah. This one's a big one.
It has to do with like how much time kids are actually spending reading.
Read the words on the page.
Yeah, like actually reading.
So the study found that in some cases, kids were only spending about 10 to 15% of class time actually reading.
10 to 15.
10 to 15%.
That's so little.
And as the authors of the study said,
Yeah.
the obvious issue is that it is quite difficult to teach reading comprehension when teachers do not ask students to read text.
Like, duh.
Right.
But it's like sometimes we need to state the obvious
We do.
because it's like you can't get better at something if you're not actually doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Practice is key.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Like, what are some of the specific teaching practices that the researchers looked at?
So one thing they looked at was whether teachers were using evidence-based practices.
Okay, for anyone listening who might not be familiar with that term, what do we mean by evidence-based practices?
Evidence-based practices are basically teaching methods that have been shown to be effective through research.
So it's not just like someone's opinion.
Right. It's not just like, I think this works.
Yeah.
It's like researchers have actually studied this,
Yeah.
and they found that this method helps kids learn.
Oh.
And one of the resources that the study looked at was the What Works Clearinghouse,
Okay.
which provides guidelines on evidence-based practices for reading comprehension.
And what did they find? Like, were teachers using these practices?
They did find some evidence of this.
Okay.
So, for example, some teachers were using stratagems like facilitating in-depth discussions about the text.
Okay, so like going beyond just those surface level questions.
Right, actually getting kids to think critically about what they were reading.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, and they also found that some teachers were teaching kids about text structure.
Okay, so like how different types of writing are organized.
Exactly. So like teaching kids about compare and contrast or cause and effect or problem and solution.
Gotcha. So like giving them those tools to understand how the text itself is put together.
Right, because that can really help with comprehension.
You can, yeah.
If you understand how the text is structured.
Yeah, like you said, it's not just about decoding the words. It's about understanding how they all fit together.
Exactly.
Okay, but I'm sensing a but here.
There's always a but.
There's always a but.
So the study also found that a lot of class time was being spent on what they called low-level comprehension questions.
Okay, what are low-level comprehension questions?
These are basically questions that focus on just recalling facts from the text.
Okay, so
Like, what was the main character's name?
Yeah, or where did the story take place?
Right, exactly. And those questions aren't bad.
Right.
Like, it's important for kids to be able to find that information in the text.
Yeah,
But the problem is that a lot of instruction didn't go beyond that.
like it stopped there.
It stopped there.
Like, okay, you can find the main character's name. Great, moving on.
Exactly. And the researchers found that teachers weren't always asking kids to elaborate on their answers or to make connections to other parts of the text or to their own background knowledge.
Right, so it's like checking if you can identify the ingredients in a recipe, but not asking you, like, why those ingredients are used or how they interact to create the final dish.
Exactly. It's like surface level understanding,
Yeah.
but not really deep comprehension.
So what about other important strategies like building background knowledge
Yeah.
or teaching comprehension skills like summarizing or questioning?
So those are definitely key components of effective comprehension instruction, and the study did find that teachers were using them to some extent.
Okay.
But again, there were some caveats.
Boy, what were they?
So, for example, a little over half of the studies that they looked at showed teachers actively working to build students' background knowledge. So that means that in a little over half of the classrooms that were observed, teachers were doing things like providing students with information about the topic before they read a text.
Okay.
or connecting the text to students' own experiences.
Okay, so like giving them some context
Exactly.
before they dive in.
Right, because if you have some background knowledge about a topic, it's easier to understand a text about that topic.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then in terms of comprehension skills, about half of the studies showed teachers providing explicit instruction in strategies like summarizing,
Okay.
predicting, questioning, visualizing.
So like actually teaching them how to do those things.
Right, not just saying, oh, you should summarize this text,
Yeah.
but actually showing them how to do it, modeling it, giving them practice.
Right, because like I was saying before, it's the difference between saying use context clues and actually showing them different types of context clues and how to use them.
Exactly.
Okay, but I feel like there's another but coming.
There is a but.
There's always a but.
So the researchers found that even when teachers were using these strategies, they weren't always implementing them in the most effective way.
Oh, I didn't mean.
So for example, sometimes teachers would just mention a strategy to students,
Right.
but they wouldn't actually model how to use it or explain why it was important.
So like they might say, okay, now we're going to make a prediction about what's going to happen next in the story,
Right.
but they wouldn't actually show kids how to
Yeah.
do that.
Exactly. And the authors of the study make this really great analogy.
Oh.
They say it's like telling students to annotate a text
Okay.
versus actually showing them how to annotate purposefully.
Yeah.
Like giving them examples of what to look for and explaining why it can help them understand the text better.
Right, because just saying annotate
Doesn't really help.
doesn't really tell you anything.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like there's still a lot of room for improvement
There is.
when it comes to how we're teaching comprehension.
But there is some good news.
Okay, tell me the good news.
So the study found that there was a shift in practices after the year 2000.
Okay, so things started to get better.
Yeah, so in studies that were conducted after 2000,
Mm-hmm.
teachers were more likely to be using those evidence-based practices that we were talking about.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and the researchers think that this might be because of a couple of big things that happened around that time.
Okay, what were they?
So in 2000, the National Reading Panel released their report,
Okay.
which was basically this huge effort to synthesize all of the research that had been done on reading instruction.
So they're like, okay, let's look at everything we know about how to teach reading
Exactly.
and figure out what works.
Right, and that report really emphasized the importance of explicit instruction in comprehension strategies.
Okay.
And then in 2002, the Reading First initiative was launched.
Okay, and what was that?
So Reading First was this big federal program that was designed to improve reading instruction in schools.
Okay.
And one of the things that Reading First emphasized was the use of scientifically based reading research.
So basically saying like, okay, we have all this research, let's actually use it.
Exactly.
Labs.
And the researchers think that these two events, the National Reading Panel report and Reading First,
Mm-hmm.
probably played a role in this shift towards more evidence-based practices.
Okay, so even though there's still room for improvement, it sounds like we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, it's definitely a positive sign.
It's good to hear some good news.
It is.
Okay. But I want to talk about another debate that's happening in the field of reading comprehension.
Ooh, a good debate.
A good debate because you know how we were talking about those different strategies like summarizing and predicting and questioning?
Yeah.
Well, there's also this idea that background knowledge is really important for comprehension.
Absolutely.
So some people are like, well, we should just focus on teaching kids as much as we can about the world.
Right, fill their heads with knowledge.
Yeah. And then they'll be able to understand anything they read.
And then other people are like, no, we need to teach them these specific strategies
Yeah.
for how to make sense of text.
So what's the answer? Like, is it knowledge or is it strategies?
Well, it's not that simple.
It's never that simple, is it?
It's never that simple.
Okay, so what's the more nuanced answer?
So the research actually shows that both background knowledge and comprehension strategies are important.
Okay, so we need both.
We need both.
Gotcha.
And one of the experts whose work is cited in the study, Kelly Cartwright,
Okay.
she makes this really great point.
What does she say?
She says it's not an either-or situation.
Okay.
It's not like you have to choose one or the other.
Yeah.
Kids need both.
I need both. Okay.
They need to have some background knowledge about the world
Yeah.
to make sense of what they're reading,
Right.
but they also need to know how to use that knowledge effectively
Yeah.
when they're reading.
So it's like you can have all the ingredients for a cake, but if you don't know how to bake a cake,
You're not going to end up with a cake.
you're just going to have a mess.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we make sure that kids are getting both the knowledge and the strategies?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It is.
But I think this study gives us some clues.
Okay, what are they?
So first of all, it highlights the importance of explicit instruction.
Okay, so we can't just assume that kids will figure these things out on their own.
Right. We need to actually teach them
Teach them, yeah.
how to use these strategies and why they're important.
And we need to give them opportunities to practice.
Lots of opportunities to practice
Yeah.
in different contexts with different types of text.
And then in terms of building background knowledge,
Yeah.
what can we do there?
Well, I think it's important to make sure that kids are exposed to a wide range of topics.
Okay.
Through reading, through discussion, through experiences.
So, like, not just sticking to one genre or one subject.
Right. Expose them to different things.
Different cultures, different time periods.
Exactly. The more background knowledge they have, the better equipped they'll be to understand new information. And I think it's also important to connect what they're learning to their own lives.
Okay.
To make it relevant to them.
Yeah, because if they can see how it relates to their own experiences,
They're more likely to be engaged.
they're more likely to remember it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I'm feeling a little more optimistic now,
Good.
knowing that we're starting to move in the right direction.
Yeah, I think there's reason to be hopeful,
Yeah,
but there's still work to be done.
there's always work to be done.
Always.
So to wrap things up, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with today?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that reading comprehension is complex.
It's not simple.
It's not simple.
Okay.
It's not just about decoding words. It's about understanding meaning,
Yeah.
making connections, thinking critically.
And it's something that needs to be explicitly taught.
Absolutely.
We can't just assume that kids will pick it up on their own.
Right.
And I think the other big takeaway is that both background knowledge and comprehension strategies are important.
Yes, we need both.
We need both.
And we need to make sure that kids are getting instruction in both of those areas.
And I think it's also encouraging to know that there has been progress
There has.
since that initial research back in the 70s.
Things are getting better.
Yeah, we're starting to see more evidence-based practices in classrooms.
And that's a good thing.
That's a really good thing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder.
Okay. I like it.
We've talked about this ongoing debate between knowledge and strategies.
Right.
But ultimately, what do you think is the most critical element in fostering deep and lasting reading comprehension? Is it the information that students possess, or is it their ability to actively engage with and process that information?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
I know, right?
I don't know if I have a good answer for that.
I don't either, but it's something to think about.
It
And
is.
I would encourage all of our listeners to really reflect on that question.
Yeah.
Maybe think back to your own experiences as a reader.
Mm.
Or if you're a parent or a teacher, think about the kids in your life
Yeah.
and what helps them to really understand what they're reading.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of reading comprehension.
It's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.